We're seeing a lot of action through enforcement. There is going to be a revolution, and it's already starting.
So what is your take on crypto regulation and governance around the world?
Well, first of all, I would say around the world is key. So I think it's really important that everybody remembers this is a global technology. And I think of it kind of like an amoeba. There's this sense, I think, in some jurisdictions, the US is one of them, that if we regulate it here in one way, then we're going to kill it dead in some fashion, right? Or the parts of it that we don't like are never going to appear somewhere else. That's just not the case. It's an amoeba. If you push it here, it's going to kind of swoop over here. And I think there are a lot of jurisdictions poised to, if the US screws it up, and if we push this tremendous economic growth engine somewhere else, someone else is going to take it. I mean, they're ready for that. I do think there are jurisdictions that will mimic what the US does, but the important thing to remember is it's a global technology. Global coordination is something that we'd love to see, and I've been saying this since my time at the forum. I think there needs to be an understanding of what this is and what it isn't. Separately from that, I think there are some jurisdictions who are really forward-thinking. Bermuda, for example, a year ago, I think now, passed some very forward-thinking regulation designed to attract businesses and industry to Bermuda to say, look, we're here to be friendly. We have strict financial regulation where we're seen as kind of a safe place to do business. At the same time, we want to make sure that we are creating enough room for innovators to really experiment here and create pilots. There are some sandboxes happening where you can kind of come into the fold, have a conversation with regulators in certain parts of the world, and then you can kind of see together, like, oh, does this make sense? What are the consequences? What's happening here? Contrast, the US, where we're seeing a lot, particularly with the SEC, we're seeing a lot of action through enforcement. So the SEC kind of going after someone and one by one, it almost seems like one by one, like in this targeted approach, and saying, okay, that thing doesn't work, or you need to come within existing rules and regulations or existing laws. And the danger there is, I describe this a lot, like, every time you're regulating something new, you can think about the internet, and I won't go down that. There's a whole lot of people you can kind of look up to find about the comparison there, right? But we're at a similar time in terms of the scope of we just don't know what's going to be built upon blockchains. We just don't know.
That's right.
The same way in the early internet, I was of an age where, Pine and all these kinds of things, right? You were like poking people and fingering people and this kind of stuff, right? Because that's the language we were using, very rudimentary kinds of things. No one saw Google coming, and it took some time for that to come. There are things like that that are going to be developed on a blockchain, and we don't know what they are. So we have to be very careful about allowing for that innovation. Now, you could certainly argue Google has pros and cons, search as a general matter, pros and cons, social media, pros and cons. Nevertheless, I think I would certainly argue we're better off with some of these things than we were. And I think that what we're trying to do now is understand where did it kind of go wrong in terms of consumer protection around the data part of it and yank some of that back. That's what Web3 can do. It can have a different approach to these kinds of things, right? But I don't think any of us would say the internet categorically a terrible thing unless we're like full-on Luddites, which
it's completely changed the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what this is going to be. There is going to be a revolution, and it's already starting. So how do we kind of get to a place where that's allowed? At the same time, there are some guardrails around it. And I don't think an enforcement, like going company by company and saying you're doing this right and wrong, is the right thing. I also talk about this a lot, like a duck. Let's say you have a bird and you're like, this is a brand new, I've never seen this bird before. Now parts of it, it's got webbed feet, it's got feathers, it must be a duck. And the more you treat it like a duck and you regulate it like a duck, well, you can't be surprised if it starts quacking. And the danger there is that all the things that really made it a peacock are lost, right? And so what I worry about in the United States and what we're kind of seeing, again, agency by agency, and even within agencies, there's a very wide distinction opinions exactly in how to treat this. But I see a lot of like duck-like approach, like, well, it's what we had before, it's the same thing, therefore regulated the same way. And next thing you know, you're going to have just a bunch of maybe different colored ducks running around in these exchanges. And that's not at all what I think we need. Because as we were speaking about earlier, the whole point of this is to create more inclusion points and more access to people that have been left out of those legacy systems by definition. So when you talk about historically excluded communities, there's a reason that a lot of those folks have not been able to access some of this, ways that they can kind of improve their lives, better their lives, families, create wealth, all these kinds of opportunities that really would be life-changing for them. Anyway, so these are the things I worry about. I am not thrilled, by what we see, in some particular approaches in the United States. There are others. There are plenty of folks in the United States in positions of leadership, lawmakers and policymakers, regulators, who I think really do understand the potential of crypto, are very much in favor of it, are really understanding not only the innovation side of it, but also the inclusion side of it. And so my hope is that those voices, there'll be more and more of those voices, and part of my goal is to help make that happen.
This is so amazing. What you're touching on is that we're still at the very beginning. It sounds like very much like the internet, we have product market fit, but we don't quite have channel product market fit. And we're still getting there and discovering all these key use cases for this technology. And, what you said really resonated with me, because you're saying basically like all of the traditional patterns that we use, today for some like regulatory purposes, whether it be like financial services or security laws, may not necessarily apply to, what the use case that we're doing it today. So it's almost like we have to, respect and take some of those experiences, but almost come up with a new system for the technology itself.
I think that's exactly right. Right? And why would we think that something that's brand new, we don't want to push it in a way and my kids play a lot with Play-Doh, and I'm always like, oh, they have these like devices where you can like make a square of the Play-Doh and you fill it up, right? And I'm like, oh, now you have a square. It went from this amazing blank canvas of a thing, and then you pushed it through a mold, and that's really cool and interesting, and it's good for your dexterity and all that kind of stuff. But now you just have that thing, and that is less interesting to me than the blank canvas that the Play-Doh was. So it may be a bad metaphor, but I think the idea here is, let's let this kind of flourish at least a bit, and let's understand and do that together. So, the forum is all about public-private collaboration, cross-sector stakeholder engagement. I'm bringing that to CCI as well. I really do think that there needs to be more conversation and more understanding happening, more relationships built in the public and private sector, and understand like where can the industry actually be engaging in some self-regulation or self-policing, because industry doesn't have interest in this being branded as the tool of criminals or fraudulent behavior either, right? But we have to also get there and figure out what are the most effective tools for making that activity very, very, very challenging to do, because it's always going to be possible if people are creative enough and motivated enough, but making it very, very hard to do, making the deterrent hard, and also making it really easy to catch. And those are things that I think we're starting to focus more and more attention on as an industry and ecosystem as well.
You mentioned CCI. Let's kind of transition over to that.
Yeah.
Congratulations on your role.
Thank you. 2 weeks in, so I have a laptop. Kidding.
That's amazing. I hear you.
You know what I mean?
Tell me more about what CCI is, what your role there is, where you see,
Sure.
that organization in the next 18 months.
Absolutely. So we're a global alliance of industry leaders. We are thinking across the spectrum, across the world, how do we create evidence-based advocacy models? So some of that evidence we have to generate. Maybe it's detailed research, papers into national security, into cybersecurity, into privacy, into all these different kinds of concepts, energy, all these things that are really important. And then how do we use that evidence that we generate to advocate on behalf of users of crypto? So I really see myself as somebody who wants to speak for the voices of users of crypto. My members are a bunch of people, different companies that have a lot of users. We tend to be some of the leading user base in the ecosystem. And so the goal here is to say, how do we protect access and opportunity for people to actually use some of these services and products, and how do we make that broader? We focus on open permissionless decentralized systems. Decentralization is a core tenet of what we're here to preserve, because I think that we have to be practical about this. There are elements of centralization that come with human behavior. And sometimes when it's fully decentralized, like you see in some DAOs, there's toxicity that lives there. So we have to be mindful of that as well. Like I tend to think that, entropy is real, and I've seen Yellow Jackets. I understand kind of where things go when left to their own devices, the Lord of the Flies. Nevertheless, I think with some structure around some of these things, they are going to prove to be a tool of empowerment for a lot of people. And so the goal is to preserve the aspects of the technology that make that more possible and more likely, and then see, where time takes us. So we speak to, policymakers, regulators all around the world. We also speak to regular people, just kind of to say, like, here is why you shouldn't be afraid of this technology. You don't necessarily have to understand the technology itself, but don't be afraid of getting a wallet, trying some of these things. It's not going to be the terrifying thing you might think it is.
That's right. It can be very intimidating because it seems very technical to some people, especially on the consumer level.
It's spoken about that way, which is, I think, a little unfortunate.
Yeah.
I don't know how my phone works. I use it all the time.
That's true. I think there's going to be an evolution of that. So
I think so.
I think one of our core goals here at Stronghold, we are blockchain and cryptocurrency and payments company, but I actually think that when you cross the caption to women, to like having the adoption of like women having creating wallets and learning more about the technology, or just not even learning more about the technology, just using it, that's going to be just the chasm that we need to cross it to.
I think so too. I mean, I think, we already know that women drive consumer decision making in households, and that's true around the world. And I think there's a new generation coming of digital natives who are going to be crypto native. So I talk about my 3 daughters a lot as girls who will be crypto native. Like, they will have a very different understanding of the engagement model. And I can fully expect my daughter, who's now 9 going on 13, to tell me, in the next decade, like, I can't believe you ever posted a photo to a platform. Like, what were you thinking, Mom? Like, how, that was crazy, you were just being scraped and exploited or whatever. I can completely see that kind of transition happening because the way that they interact digitally, and it's just so fluid, and so it's become that for me because I'm in tech, but I think most of my law school classmates and others who aren't necessarily as tech savvy or tech forward, it's not as fluid for them. Like, they very much have an online, they go online and then they go offline, right? Whereas for most of us who work in these fields, you're kind of fluid in your identity across these things, and that's becoming more and more the norm.
That's right. And then to your point is that it's going to be user-facing and it's going to be more and more the norm, but you don't really necessarily have to know how the technology works. Right. It's not like, we're on Facebook or Google and we ask them, hey, what's your database? Like, nobody knows what the answer to that is. And I think that maybe that's what we typically ask in this space. So it has some evolving of language that needs to happen to get more usability.
Yeah, and I think that the bigger barrier to entry for folks is that they think they have to, like, what's a hard wallet? What's a cold store? How do I do? You're like, well, you don't really have to. It's okay. Like, you don't really have to do any of that. So I do think that, again, as a society, we empower wealthy people to take more risks than people who don't have so much money. And so there's a reason this has started, I think, at the upper echelons of income and wealth in our society. You got wealth advisors now advising on crypto holdings as part of a diversified retirement portfolio, for example, right? But I think we need to really step away from that a little bit and say, okay, that's because Bitcoin has been very volatile. And so I think there were folks that were like, well, am I going to be savvy enough to know when to exit and when to enter and all that kind of stuff, right? So I don't lose a lot of value that's really, really critical to my family's well-being. It's like I can put some, I can dabble a bit in this, right? If you don't have that dabble ability, then I think we need to think about how are we creating the same opportunities for folks like that. That to me it just has to be a priority. And if we don't prioritize it as an industry, it's not going to happen. So part of what I want to do is really say, like, again, evidence-based advocacy. We have to demonstrate this is happening. We have to show how it's happening. And we have to really be intentional about creating inclusive models, or we are going to wind up in a world where this is yet another kind of tool of super wealthy people to just kind of like make even more money on top of their money. And that is certainly not what I'm here to do.